One day in 1416, a great scholar and translator in Florence, Leonardo Bruni, wrote excitedly about how he was finally about to meet someone whom he'd long admired and hoped to encounter. Bruni was not actually going to have a face-to-face with him, because this man he wanted to meet, Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, had been dead for more than 1,300 years. What Bruni was looking forward to seeing, what he'd been dying to see for many years, was a book written by Quintilian, the Institutio Oratoria, aka On the Education of an Orator, which was about, among other things, the art of making a good speech. This work from ancient Rome, from the 1st century AD, had been lost for centuries, or rather, whole and complete copies had been lost, and all that anyone had seen, for as long as anyone could remember, were mutilated and incomplete copies, mere fragments of the wisdom that Quintilian, a famous teacher, had once dispensed to budding heads of state in imperial Rome. But now, suddenly, in 1416, a whole and complete copy of Quintilian had been found in, of all places, a monastery library in Switzerland. Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King, and this is Renaissance Discoveries. And in this episode, we're going to look at the discovery, or as so often, the rediscovery of something from the past that would be put to use in the present for the sake of a better future. In this case, this much sought after manuscript of Quintilian. Now I know what you're wondering. What was an ancient Roman book on making effective speeches doing in a library for monks in Switzerland? Why did people such as Bruni suddenly want to read it? Who made this remarkable discovery? And how did a book written by an ancient Roman teacher survive for 1,300 years? In fact, how did any book written by the ancient Romans, or the ancient Greeks for that matter, survive the centuries? These questions are important because they help us understand the transmission of knowledge, how knowledge survives and why sometimes it doesn't. And they shine a light on the motives, the passions, and the ideas of the people who created what we call the Renaissance. If we think about it, ancient knowledge, philosophy, literature, ideas, all these productions of the human mind are incredibly fragile because books and manuscripts are fragile. They're not made from marble or limestone. They don't stand 150 feet high in the middle of a city. Ideas are conveyed by ink on paper or parchment, or even papyrus, by ink that fades, papyrus or parchment that gets eaten by mice or cockroaches, or that gets burned in a fire or blown up during wartime. And so these pages, which bear the intellectual treasures of humanity, hung by the most fragile threads. They crossed the choppy waters of the centuries in leaky vessels. And in order to survive, they needed special conditions and protection, a lot of luck, and the people, like those I'm going to be talking about, who were determined to save them and pass them on to future generations. Let me start with the man who made the remarkable discovery of Quintilian's manuscript. His name was Poggio Bracciolini. He was from the country, born in 1380 in a small village 35 miles southeast of Florence, a village that now proudly bears his name, but he always signed his name Poggio Florentinus, proudly identifying himself with the city to which, in about 1400, at the age of 20, with only a few coins in his pocket, he moved for his studies and to look for work. After he'd finished his training in Florence as a notary, think lawyer, he worked briefly as a scribe before going to Rome to work for the Pope in the Curia, the papal bureaucracy. Here he toiled unhappily and for very little pay, dreaming of a life free from what he called the bustle of civilization, with plenty of leisure for writing books and even more for collecting them. Poggio had a good friend back in Florence, a friend named Niccolo Niccoli. There's no known picture of him, unfortunately, no visual record, which is a real shame because Niccoli was a striking character who cut a real dash, a plump, handsome, fastidious man who dressed in a long purple robe and who lived in what was supposedly the most beautifully decorated house in Florence, complete with marble statues, antique urns, mosaic tables, a big map of the world, and paintings by distinguished Florentine masters, many of whom were his good friends. Niccoli's most impressive possessions, though, were his books, that is, manuscripts, because we're talking about a period a few decades before the invention of the printing press. Niccoli was, as a friend noted approvingly, a glutton for books. He owned some 800 manuscripts, which was one of the largest and most valuable collections in all of Europe at that time. But Niccoli wanted more manuscripts. He wanted them not because he was a dilettante who simply wanted to collect books for the sake of it. Books had a use value to him. He loaned them out to his friends. He invited people to come to his house to read and discuss them in a kind of early book group. And he was incredibly generous in loaning them out. At one point, 200 of his books, fully a quarter of them, were out on loan to various people. So Niccoli wanted to collect and spread knowledge, especially the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans. But he knew that only a fraction of that knowledge remained by the 1400s. He and his friend Bruni once discussed a plan for a revival of learning. Bruni was very bullish, but Niccoli pessimistic for the simple reason that the kind of knowledge necessary for this revival was missing, lost, or destroyed. As proof, Niccoli began listing the terrible losses, that is, all of the books of the ancients that they knew about, that Niccoli and his friends knew about, that they knew had been written, but which no one had seen for many centuries. Just to give a quick example, maybe the most knowledgeable and prolific writer in the ancient world was a chap named Marcus Varro, who happened to be Julius Caesar's librarian. Varro is known to have written hundreds of books covering virtually all areas of human thought and endeavor, from agriculture and antiquities to the duties of a husband, best way to raise children, and so forth. However, nothing of this encyclopedic learning survived apart from a single treatise on Latin that had been discovered in a Benedictine monastery in the 1350s by the Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, the man who wrote the Decameron. So the losses were catastrophic. One of the ancient works that Poggio, Niccoli, and their friends most wanted to find was one of these casualties, or a partial casualty, Quintilian's book on rhetoric. It was about more than just how to give a good speech. It gave a detailed account of the Roman educational system. It argued for a curriculum that formed the entire person, what we might call a character building education or a universal education that would allow the student to speak with eloquence and authority on any subject. Quintilian students were intended to become virtuous and capable citizens and inspired political leaders, men who were, as Quintilian boasted, fit for the management of public and private business. He said that he wanted to create the vir bonus dicendi peritus, the good man skilled in speaking, someone who was both articulate and virtuous, someone who combined his eloquence with integrity and used his oratorical powers for the good of his society to make that society better. We can see why a book like this would make people sit up and pay attention. A book like this would allow people in the 1400s to tap into the secrets of Roman success, because Poggio Niccoli Bruni and many others believed that the ancient Romans had created a hugely successful model of society, a much better one than theirs, for example. And so they wanted to know how its success could be replicated, at least in part, in the modern world. The secret, of course, was books like Quintilian. But the question was where, if anywhere, a complete Quintilian could be found. Niccol believed, rightly as it turns out, that the best hunting grounds for ancient manuscripts were north of the Alps, in the dim and dusty monasteries of what is now France and Germany. And so when Poggio Bracciolini got the chance in 1414 to travel north of the Alps to Constance in present-day southern Germany, Niccol encouraged him to go on a manuscript hunt in any of the monasteries he came across and to see if he might find anything interesting. Now we'll leave Poggio as he makes his way across the Alps, and before we get back to him, I want to look at how and why these ancient books, so many of them, disappeared in the first place. It's been estimated that we have today only a very small fraction, less than 1% of all Latin literature ever written. That is, works written during the Roman Republic and Empire. This is a period of hundreds of years across an advanced and literate culture. Less than 1% is a gruesome statistic. And if you ask someone during Poggio or Niccol's time, the reason for this 99% loss rate, they had an answer. It was largely, they believed, the fault of the early Christians, especially popes such as Sylvester and Gregory the Great, who carried out, they believed, acts of deliberate destruction in Rome. In other words, Florentines of the 13 and 1400s blamed the Christianization of the Roman Empire 1,000 years earlier, when there was a pagan to Christian switchover, with Christianity fighting with the old pagan religions and cultures for the hearts and minds of the people of the empire. This view of a sort of Christian vandalism of classical culture was most famously and influentially expressed by a contemporary and friend of Niccol, the sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti, the man who designed and cast the Gates of Paradise on Florence's baptistry. Ghiberti wrote that after Christianity gained the upper hand in the Roman Empire, idolatry was persecuted such that pagan statues, paintings, and so forth were all systematically destroyed. The figure most often singled out for blame was Pope Gregory, Gregory the Great, who supposedly knocked the heads off all the statues in Rome and destroyed the pagan books in the Palatine Library. Gregory certainly comes in for serious stick in a long poem called the Ditamondo by one Fazio degli Uberti, who died in 1367. He was a Florentine contemporary of Giovanni Boccaccio. In this poem, an allegorical figure of Rome cast as a woman laments her current pitiful condition. Alas, how I'm still pained by the memory of my great, beautiful, and noble monuments, which Gregory destroyed. I still bemoan the writings of my sons and the leaders of my armies, those works collected together with such labor, and nearly all damaged or destroyed by this pope. And here we see an illustration done for manuscript copy with the black-robed figure of Rome grieving over her losses like a war widow mourning the dead. This would become a kind of truism, one of the grand myths of the Renaissance, its founding myth, we might say, i.e., that the early Christians had deliberately and on a large scale destroyed the pagan culture of ancient Rome, which the Florentines of the 1400s then tried to galvanize and resuscitate. This myth about Christian destruction was given booster rockets in later centuries by people such as Edward Gibbon in the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and Friedrich Nietzsche in the Antichrist. The interpretation has a basis in truth because the advent of Christianity obviously had a negative impact on the transmission of knowledge, or at least some knowledge, from antiquity. After all, Christianity was in a fight in the 4th and 5th centuries, especially for the hearts and minds of the people of the empire. However, historians today are much more cautious about seeing things in terms of such a hostile and destructive confrontation, about seeing the same sort of bitter opposition and deliberate large-scale vandalism that Lorenzo Ghiberti and others described. And in fact, even during the 1400s, it was known that the Pope Gregory stories were myths invented at some point during the Middle Ages. It's a little too easy to blame the Christians because, in fact, only a small part of pagan literature was deliberately targeted and destroyed. The attitude of Christian leaders and thinkers towards pagan literature was more complicated, as more nuanced and detailed recent studies of pagan Christian relations have argued. Instead, something else led to the loss of far more ancient books, something for which you could argue the Christians were responsible, but only indirectly and in some ways accidentally, and that was a change in technology. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, none of them would recognize a book as we know it today, because all of their works were written on papyrus scrolls, that is, on long scrolls made from the reed that grew in the swamps of Egypt, and that the Egyptians naturally had used for their own documents. This format was familiar throughout the Mediterranean world. However, competition between ancient libraries soon brought forth a new technology. Sometime just after about 200 BC, one of the Ptolemies, i.e., from the ruling family of Egypt, banned the export of papyrus in order to foil the ruler of Pergamum, Eumenes II, whose domains were in what is now Western Turkey, and who was hoping to create a library even grander than the famous one in Alexandria. Forced to find a substitute for the choked off supply of papyrus, Eumenes hit on the expedient of carefully prepared animal skins, that is, parchment, whose name comes from Pergamum. By the last quarter of the first century AD, parchment could be found in certain Roman bookshops, not rolled up in scrolls, but instead cut into small rectangles and fastened together. So suddenly it was possible to read a document by turning pages of parchment rather than unspooling a roll of papyrus. However, parchment never really caught on among the ancient Romans, maybe because it always carried the connotation of an inferior substitute, and the papyrus scroll would remain the chosen vehicle for classical literature through the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. But if the pagans seemed to spurn parchment, another culture embraced it, i.e., the followers of Christ. Christians may have favored it because of their more limited access to papyrus and because of advantages such as pagination, which made it easier to find passages of text, essentially if you're studying the Bible. And also this new format could hold a greater amount of information on less material than a scroll because the scribe could write on both sides of the page. Christianity therefore brought about not only a change in moral and religious values, but also one in the technology of knowledge. Both of these changes imperiled the chances of ancient knowledge surviving into future centuries. Because let's take a look at what had to happen for Quintilian's work to survive the centuries, to get from Quintilian's hands at the end of the first century AD into those of Poggio Bracciolini or Niccolo Niccoli some 1300 years later. Quintilian's work was originally written on papyrus scrolls in about 90 AD, and there were no doubt hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of these scrolls because the education of an orator was a very popular work used in elite education. Papyrus is not that fragile, but nonetheless, it probably has a life, unless scrupulously preserved, of only a couple of hundred years. So for the Quintilian, or for the work of any ancient author to survive into the Middle Ages, let's say to get to the year 1000, at least one of these scrolls, before it perished, as it certainly would, had to be copied onto parchment by the Christians. So pagan literature had to get through a bottleneck. It had to get off of papyrus and onto parchment. But in order to do so, it had to be deemed worthy or useful by the Christian scribes, by monks, or by the Christian authorities in general. So the educational requirements or literary qualities of the pagan scroll needed to be weighed up against possible religious reservations. But, and I'll come to this in a couple of minutes, some pagan works were copied even despite strong religious reservations. Anyway, this is the scenario then. At some point around 400, 500, 600 AD, a scribe or scholar, a scribe who by this time would have been a Christian, needed to take a papyrus scroll containing Quintilian's writings and reproduce the contents on parchment so that it could survive for at least a few hundred more years. Crucially, in many cases, this did happen with classical literature. A great many pagan works were copied by Christian scribes and scholars, even by monks, and in fact, especially by monks. In 529 AD, Saint Benedict established at Monte Cassino a monastic community that included a library. He wrote a set of rules for his community, the famous rule of Saint Benedict, that is, the playbook for his monastery, and it became the template for almost all monasteries that followed over the next 500 years and beyond. This is a copy, the oldest surviving one, done in England around about 700 AD. Books had an important role in the monastery, in Monte Cassino, as in all those that copied it. Benedict declared that if the monks weren't working, they were supposed to be reading. During Lent, for example, each monk was to receive a book from the library and read it all the way through. So every monastery needed to have at least one book for every monk, and every monk, crucially, had to be literate. Monks were thus consumers of books, but they also became producers, making copies in the scriptorium, the special writing room set aside in the monastery for the use of scribes who copied manuscripts, and they often copied manuscripts that they borrowed from other monasteries. There was an exchange between and among these monasteries, with monks from Monte Cassino, for example, traveling back and forth with books to, for example, the monastery in Bobbio in northern Italy, which was founded by the Irish monk Saint Columban or Columbanus in 614 AD, so in the next century after Benedict. And Bobbio soon had the finest library in Italy, with almost 700 manuscripts, including works by Greek and Latin authors such as Aristotle, Cicero, Ovid, Virgil, Lucretius, and so forth. The Irish, such as Columbanus and his followers, were absolutely crucial to the preservation and transmission of knowledge, not least because they went as missionaries to the European continent when Europe was troubled by war with the Lombards, the last of the barbarians in effect. And they came with their own distinctive handwriting and the conviction that books were essential for Christian living. This is a page from a beautiful little gospel, a pocket gospel copied by an Irish scribe in 800 or 900 AD, now in the British Library in London. Columbanus and his followers founded monasteries with scriptoria, not only at Bobbio, but also one near Luxeuil in Burgundy, and also at other places such as St. Gallen. St. Gallen had a particularly well-stocked library and active scriptorium, such that by the 830s, there were 100 monks busy copying manuscripts. So these religious institutions became the guardians and preservers of much ancient literature. They even reproduced controversial or notorious ancient works, including one of the most disturbing of all from a Christian point of view, and even, we should note, from a pagan point of view, On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, who in this work outlined the theories of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. At least 5 monasteries, including Bobbio, had Lucretius manuscripts in their libraries by the year 900, all of them recently copied from works made by other Christian scribes many centuries earlier, works that are no longer extant, but which were obviously still around and being copied in the 9th century. St. Gallen does not appear to have had a copy of Lucretius, or at least if it did, it no longer had it by 1400, but it did have something else, and that was a full and complete copy of Quintilian. So let's now get back to Poggio Bracciolini. He arrived in Constance in the autumn of 1414 with his employer, his boss, Pope John the 23rd, for a general council of the church, i.e., to settle various ecclesiastical debates, including who should be pope, because there were 3 claimants at this point. This particular issue was not concluded to John's satisfaction, since he was deposed by the council. He now counts as an anti-pope. And so Poggio, losing his boss, suddenly found himself at a loose end. And so over the next 2 years, at the behest of Niccoli, he began exploring local monasteries in search of manuscripts. He and 2 of his friends ultimately arrived at St. Gallen in the summer of 1416. Now, if St. Gallen had been a hive of intellectual industry and scribal activity 500 years earlier, by 1416, if we can believe Poggio, it was in a dreadful state. Poggio claimed that he found a volume containing 6 speeches of Cicero in a heap of scrap paper destined for the rubbish. He and his friends were distressed by the fact that the abbot and monks were such poor custodians of their treasures, but their sorrow turned to disbelief and joy when they discovered among these sorry ruins the book that had been sought for more than 5 centuries, a complete copy of Quintilian's Education of an Orator. Poggio tried to acquire this precious volume from the monks, recognizing that Quintilian, as he wrote, could not much longer have endured the filth of that prison and the savage cruelty of his keepers. However, the abbot refused to part with it, so Poggio spent the next 32 days hastily copying out the entire text. Poggio wrote letters telling all of his friends what he'd found, and his discovery was widely celebrated. Niccoli and Bruni urged him to send a copy of the manuscript to Florence immediately. Poggio also received a letter of congratulations from another friend, a wealthy scholar from Venice named Francesco Barbaro, who praised him for bringing such a wise man as Quintilian back to life. Thanks to Poggio's discoveries, Barbaro rejoiced, our descendants will be able to live well and honorably. The wisdom would now bring the human race more benefit, he wrote, because such a book would bring advantages not only to private concerns, but to cities, nations, and finally to all mankind. Barbaro even fondly imagined that one day someone holding what he called the highest office of government would be steeped in classical works like those of Quintilian, with happy consequences for humanity. A kind of philosopher king would emerge, uniting power with wisdom. In other words, we would have the vir bonus dicendi peritus, the good man skilled in speaking, dreamt of centuries earlier by Quintilian and in desperately short supply in the 1400s. Following his discovery of Quintilian, Poggio continued his searches. He traveled in France, Germany, the Swiss cantons. He sent copies of all the works that he found back to Florence, to Bruni and Niccoli. So all of this ancient knowledge, after its migrations around Europe, after flowing back and forth across the Channel and the Alps, after finding refuge in monasteries, and after centuries of eclipse and neglect, was coming to Florence. And Florence was becoming renowned more than anywhere else in Europe as the place where ancient manuscripts were collected, where the classics were studied, preserved, and esteemed. One of the first people to get a copy of the Quintilian discovered by Poggio was a young banker in Florence, one Cosimo de' Medici, and he would aspire in the decades that followed to become the kind of leader, wise and prudent, championed by Quintilian. But that is another story. I leave you with the words of the great Florentine bookseller Vespasiano da Bisticci, written in praise of his friends Poggio, Niccoli, and Bruni. How much men of letters owe to these men who shone such a light. And for anyone who wants to know more about how this light shone in Florence in the 1400s, thanks to men such as Poggio and Niccoli, as well as Vespasiano, or to know anything more about anything I've talked about, and much more besides, I humbly and modestly refer you to my latest work, The Bookseller of Florence, available in your favorite bookshop.